The gymnasium had gone quiet in that particular way a room goes quiet when a 12-year-old raises her hand and the adults on the stage aren't sure whether to call on her. Why did she leave that day? I wasn't in that gymnasium. I heard about it secondhand, 3 months after I'd already stopped wearing the uniform that had defined 14 years of my life, from a friend who called me still catching her breath. My daughter, Sophia, had stood up during a base values of service panel, in front of 200 folding chairs full of families, and asked that question directly to the man seated at the center table, Lieutenant Colonel Grant Osei, 3 months retired himself, invited back as a guest speaker because somebody thought his career made a good example for military kids. He hadn't expected a 7th grader in the 3rd row to know exactly who he was talking about, because that senior NCO was her mother. I need to back up, because none of that gymnasium moment makes sense without telling you who I was before it, and what actually happened the day I left. Please subscribe my Brave Lady channel and also write in comment from where are you watching. Thank you. I'm Master Sergeant Elena Vasquez, U.S. Army, and for the 6 years before all this, I'd served as the Senior Logistics and Maintenance NCO for a mechanized support company at Fort Drayton. 14 years total in the Army by then, most of them spent in roles nobody photographs for recruiting posters, inventory, equipment readiness, the unglamorous discipline of making sure that when soldiers needed something to work, it worked. I'd raised my daughter Sophia mostly on my own since her father's deployment schedule and our marriage stopped overlapping in any meaningful way, back when she was 6. By the time she was 12, it was just the two of us and a small rented house 2 miles off base, string lights on the porch she'd insisted on hanging herself, a corkboard in the kitchen covered in her school schedule and my duty roster color-coded so neither of us missed anything that mattered. The spring before I left, things at work still felt, on the surface, entirely normal. I remember a Tuesday night, Sophia doing homework at the kitchen table while I filled out equipment readiness reports, when she looked up and asked, "Do you like your job, Mom?" I told her I did, that most days, my job was making sure other people's jobs went smoothly, and there was something satisfying in that, even if nobody handed you a medal for it. I meant it completely. I had no idea, that Tuesday, how soon that satisfaction was going to collide with something much uglier. What I didn't know yet was that Lieutenant Colonel Osei had, for months, been quietly pressuring a young specialist under my supervision to falsify maintenance readiness logs on a set of vehicles that had failed inspection twice. I didn't know that the specialist, a 20-year-old named Jonah Pratt, had been carrying that pressure alone, terrified of what would happen to his career if he refused a direct request from a lieutenant colonel or what would happen to him if he didn't. I found out on a Thursday afternoon, in the maintenance bay, and by the following Monday, I was gone from that unit entirely. That's the day my daughter, 3 months later, in front of 200 people, wanted the truth about. I found Jonah Pratt in the maintenance bay after hours, sitting on an overturned equipment crate, staring at a clipboard he wasn't actually reading. Pratt was easy to spot in any room, tall, built like he'd played high school football and never quite lost the posture, with a habit of clicking his pen 3 times before he said anything he was nervous about. I heard the pen clicking before I saw him. "You good, Pratt?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. When he finally did, his voice was smaller than I'd ever heard it. "Sergeant, if I show you something, are you going to have to report it? Are you required to?" "Depends what it is," I said, sitting down across from him. "Try me." He handed me a folder. Inside were 2 sets of maintenance readiness reports for the same 3 vehicles, one that reflected what he and I both knew to be true, failed brake and suspension inspections that needed parts we'd been waiting on for 6 weeks, and a second version, cleaner, every line marked passed, ready for a battalion-level readiness review scheduled for the following week. "Colonel Osei told me to submit the second one," Pratt said. "He said the review numbers needed to look a certain way this cycle. Said it was just paperwork, that the actual repairs would catch up before anyone drove those vehicles anywhere that mattered." I told him I didn't feel right about it. He told me my performance evil was coming up soon, and that he hoped I understood how these things work. Pratt looked up at me, and I saw exactly how young 20 could be. "I don't know what to do, Sergeant. I want to tell you my first reaction wasn't anger, but that would be a lie. My first reaction was cold, focused anger, the kind that doesn't shout, The kind that starts calculating instead. You did the right thing showing me this, I told him. Don't submit anything else until I get back to you. I mean that. I took the folder home that night. I made copies before I made any decisions, because 14 years in this job had taught me that paperwork disappears exactly when you need it most. The following Monday, I brought both versions of the report directly to Lieutenant Colonel Osei's office and asked him, as plainly as I knew how, why there were two sets of readiness numbers for the same vehicles. Osei didn't raise his voice. That was, I'd learn, never his method. He leaned back in his chair, folded his hands, and said, Sergeant Vasquez, I think you're overcomplicating something simple. Readiness reporting has some flexibility built into it. I'd hate for something like this to become a career issue for you, over paperwork. With respect, sir, this isn't flexibility. This is falsifying safety inspection results on vehicles soldiers are going to be riding in. That's a strong word for a rounding issue, he said. I told him I wouldn't sign off on the clean version, and that I intended to flag the discrepancy through proper channels if the falsified report went forward. He thanked me, in a tone that had nothing to do with gratitude, for sharing my concerns, and told me he'd take it under advisement. 3 days later, I was called into a meeting with the battalion commander and informed that, due to performance concerns raised about my leadership approach with junior soldiers, I was being reassigned effective immediately to an administrative logistics post 2 hours away, a lateral move on paper, a demotion in every way that mattered, with no explanation offered beyond a single sentence. Sometimes it's best for everyone involved to make a clean break. I didn't get to say goodbye to my section. I didn't get to explain anything to Pratt, who I later learned had been told, by someone other than me, that I'd requested the transfer myself. I packed my desk in under an hour, under supervision, like I was being escorted out for something I'd done wrong instead of something I'd refused to do. That was the day. That was the Thursday into Monday my daughter would ask about, 3 months later, in a gymnasium, in front of 200 people, because by then, all she'd been told by classmates repeating what their parents had heard was that her mother had abandoned her unit without warning, without caring enough to stay. She didn't know the real version. I hadn't told her the real version. I'd made the mistake of thinking I was protecting her by keeping it simple. Mom got reassigned, that's all, nothing to worry about. I didn't yet understand that silence, even well-intentioned silence, leaves room for someone else's version of events to move in and take up residence. I want to tell you what the next several weeks looked like, after the reassignment, because the damage didn't stop at losing my position. It compounded. My new post was 2 hours from Fort Drayton, in a building I'd never worked in, doing administrative logistics work that felt, for the first month, like being handed someone else's job halfway through and told to finish it without a manual. I drove home to Sofia most weekends, the 2 hours each way giving me exactly enough time to rehearse conversations I never quite had the nerve to finish having with her. She asked, more than once, why I seemed different, quieter, she said, like I was somewhere else even when I was sitting right across from her. I told her work had gotten complicated. It was the truth, just not all of it, and I've had a year now to sit with how much that half-truth cost both of us. The first thing I noticed, professionally, was how fast the story moved without me in the room to correct it. First Sergeant Rosa Ibarra, the one person from my old section who still called me regularly, told me during one of those calls, people are saying you got moved because you couldn't handle the section anymore. Some people are saying you had some kind of breakdown. Ibarra had a habit of saying hard things without softening them, which is exactly why I trusted her. I've been telling people that's not what happened, but I don't actually know what did happen, Elena. Nobody's telling me anything either. I can't get into all of it yet, I told her. I need you to trust me on that part. I do trust you, she said. I just want you to know what's filling the silence while you figure out what to say. That was the first cliffhanger of many that spring, realizing the story replacing the truth was already spreading faster than I could contain it, and I didn't even have the full shape of my own narrative to correct it with yet. The second injustice arrived 2 weeks later, when I requested a formal review of my reassignment through the Inspector General's office, only to discover that my personnel file now included a written performance counseling statement, dated the week before my transfer, alleging communication issues with junior enlisted personnel, a document I had never seen, never signed, and never been counseled on in person, which is required by regulation before something like that goes in a permanent file. I called Deborah immediately. Someone backdated a counseling statement, I told her. It's not just a bad story anymore. It's a fabricated document. That's not paperwork sloppiness, Deborah said, her voice going flat and careful. That's someone building a file to make sure you couldn't fight this later. The third reveal came from an unexpected direction. Captain Diane Kessler, OSE's executive officer, reached out to me, not officially, just a text, late on a Tuesday night. I signed off on some things I shouldn't have. I don't know what to do with that. I'm sorry. I stared at that message for a long time before responding. When I called her, she wouldn't say much more, only that she'd been told the counseling statement was standard documentation and had processed it without reading it closely, trusting OSE's judgment the way you're trained to trust rank. She wasn't ready to say more than that yet. I didn't push her. I recognized, even through my own anger, the particular fear of someone who knew they'd been used and hadn't figured out yet what it would cost them to say so out loud. I went to see a military legal assistance attorney the following week, a soft-spoken JAG captain named Marcus Deng, who listened to the entire account without interrupting, then set his pen down and said, "Here's what matters right now. Feelings won't move this file. Documents will. I want everything Pratt showed you preserved exactly as it was, dated, with a clear record of when you received it. I want Deborah's account of the rumor timeline in writing. And I want you to stay completely quiet on anything informal, no confrontations, no angry emails to OSE. Every conversation from this point forward, assume it's part of the record, because eventually, it will be. How long does something like this usually take?" I asked. "Longer than you want it to," Deng said. "But a fabricated counseling statement is not a small thing to prove, once you can prove it. That's our strongest thread. Pull on that one first." He slid a legal pad across the desk toward me. "Write down every name who might have touched this file between the day you left and the day you found out about the statement. Don't guess at motive yet. Just names and dates. Motive comes later, once we know who had access." I spent that evening at my kitchen table, Sophia doing homework across from me the way she always did, making that list. It felt strange, writing down names of people I'd worked alongside for years, treating them like suspects instead of colleagues. Sophia looked up once and asked what I was working on. "Just some paperwork for work," I told her, which was true in the narrowest possible sense, and which I've regretted saying that plainly ever since, because it was the moment I could have told her something closer to the truth and chose not to. I spent the following weeks doing something that, looking back, was the steadying breath I needed between all the emotional peaks. I went back to the basics of the job I still had, at my new administrative post, learning an unfamiliar logistics system, training 2 junior soldiers on inventory procedures neither of us had used before. There was something grounding about competence, even competence in an assignment I hadn't chosen. It reminded me I hadn't actually lost the thing that mattered. I still knew how to do this job well. Someone had just tried to convince everyone else otherwise. The fourth injustice arrived by way of a phone call I hadn't expected, from a supply sergeant named Diaz who'd worked 2 desks down from me for 3 years and had never once, in all that time, called me at home. "I probably shouldn't be telling you this," he said, "but I heard Colonel OSE talking to the new incoming NCO about your old section. He told her, I'm not making this up, that you'd left because you couldn't keep up with the operational tempo anymore. Said it like it was common knowledge. She's going to walk into that section believing that about you before she's even met anyone in it." That was the moment the situation stopped feeling like a private grievance and started feeling like something actively being rebuilt in my absence, a version of my career being handed forward to people who'd never known the real one. If he was already briefing my replacement with a story that wasn't true, I remember thinking, how many other rooms had I already lost before I'd even had the chance to walk into them? The fifth injustice was the one that hurt the most, because it involved Pratt directly. Deborah told me, during one of our calls, that OSE had spoken to the section shortly after my transfer, framing the entire episode as an example of healthy leadership turnover, and had specifically told Pratt, privately, that if anyone asked him about the readiness reports, the correct answer was that everything had been resolved appropriately before Sergeant Vasquez left. Pratt, 20 years old, scared for his career, had gone along with it. He'd stayed quiet. Not out of malice, out of fear, the same fear that had brought him to me with that folder in the first place, just now aimed in a different direction. I didn't blame him. I understood exactly what that kind of fear felt like from the inside. But it meant the one piece of first-hand testimony that could confirm the falsified reports had gone quiet, right when I needed it most. 3 months passed like that, documentation moving slowly through official channels, my legal case building one careful piece at a time, and my daughter, at home, hearing an entirely different, uglier version of events from other kids on base whose parents had heard Osei's retirement dinner remarks and repeated them without ever hearing mine. I didn't know how much of that had reached her until the day I got the call from the gymnasium. Sophia told me later that she hadn't planned to say anything. She'd gone to the Values of Service panel with her school group because attendance was mandatory, sat in the third row, and listened to Lieutenant Colonel Osei talk for 20 minutes about legacy and loyalty, right up until he said the line about a senior NCO who'd never really cared about this unit and walked away without so much as a conversation. She raised her hand before she'd fully decided to. Why did she leave that day? Sophia asked, standing now, her voice carrying farther than a 12-year-old's voice usually does in a gymnasium. You keep saying she didn't care. But I'm her daughter, and even I don't actually know why she left. Do you? The room, by every account I got afterward, went completely silent. Osei, caught in front of 200 people by a question he clearly hadn't expected to come from a child in the audience, tried to redirect something about respecting the privacy of personnel matters, something about not wanting to speak for someone who wasn't present. But the base public affairs officer running the panel, a colonel named Renata Ashworth who happened to also sit on the review board handling my Inspector General complaint, recognized my daughter's last name the moment Sophia said it, and recognized, more importantly, that Osei's answer had suddenly become very evasive for a man who'd spent 20 minutes speaking freely about everyone else's careers. Ashworth didn't let it go. Colonel Osei, she said, in front of the entire room, since the question's been asked directly, do you have documentation supporting the account you've given tonight? He didn't. Or rather, he had documentation, the backdated counseling statement, but Ashworth had already been reviewing the Inspector General file that week, including Deng's formal request comparing the counseling statement's creation date against the personnel system's edit history, a piece of evidence Deng had been quietly building for weeks. She knew, standing in that gymnasium, that the paper trail didn't support the story Osei had just told 200 people. What she said next, according to 3 separate parents who told me about it afterward, was simple and devastating in its plainness. Then I'd suggest we not characterize a personnel matter you can't document, in front of an audience that includes that soldier's own child. The panel ended early. Nobody clapped. I wasn't there for any of it. I got the full account 3 days later, in a formal hearing room with government beige walls and a single window with the blinds half drawn, when I was finally called in to testify, and Captain Diane Kessler, the executive officer who'd texted me that apology weeks earlier, stood up and, for the first time, said everything she hadn't been ready to say before. I processed that counseling statement without verifying it, Kessler said, her voice steady but her hands visibly gripping the edge of the table, because Colonel Osei told me it needed to go in before your reassignment took effect, and I didn't question a superior officer's timeline. I found out afterward the date didn't line up with any actual counseling session. I should have said something the moment I realized that. I didn't, because I was afraid of what it would mean for my own career. I'm saying it now, in front of everyone in this room, because a 12-year-old girl had more courage than I did, and I've been sitting with that for 3 days. Osei's expression, for the first time in the entire proceeding, shifted not to anger, but to something closer to genuine surprise. He hadn't expected Kessler to break rank. He'd built his entire account on the assumption that the people who'd gone along with him quietly would keep doing so. Then came the twist none of us had fully expected. Jonah Pratt, subpoenaed as a witness, sat in that hearing room, clicking his pen 3 times before he spoke, the same habit I'd recognized from the maintenance bay all those months earlier, and when finally asked directly whether the vehicles in question had passed inspection, said quietly, no. They hadn't. I was told to say they had. I'm sorry it took me this long to say that out loud. And then, unprompted, he added something none of us knew, that after my transfer, Osei had asked him to falsify a second set of readiness numbers for a different vehicle rotation, months later, and that Pratt had refused that time, citing what had happened to me as the reason. I figured if telling the truth got Sergeant Vasquez moved out for nothing, at least somebody should learn from it, he said. I just didn't say it loud enough, soon enough. There's a second file, too. Colonel Osei asked me to backdate a training log for a different soldier around the same time. I didn't do it, but I know he asked someone else, because that soldier came to me scared, the same way I went to Sergeant Vasquez. The room went quiet in a different way this time, not the stunned quiet of a confrontation landing, but the heavier quiet of everyone in the room realizing the pattern was larger than any one of them had understood walking in. Osei sat through all of it with his hands folded, the same posture he'd used in his office the day I first brought him those 2 reports, except this time, there was nothing left to lean back on. The findings came down 5 weeks later. My reassignment was formally reversed and reclassified as retaliatory, the fabricated counseling statement was expunged from my file, and I was offered, though I ultimately declined, choosing instead to finish out my time in a role closer to home for Sophia's sake, reinstatement to my original section. Lieutenant Colonel Osei, already retired, faced a referral for further review of his conduct that would follow him past retirement, including the falsified safety documentation, a matter serious enough to affect his retired pay and status. The second falsified training log Pratt had mentioned was traced back to another soldier in the section, a young private who'd been too frightened to come forward on his own, and whose record was quietly corrected once the pattern became undeniable. Osei never contacted me directly, not once, through any of it. I heard, through Iborra, that he'd tried to frame the entire proceeding to old colleagues as a misunderstanding blown out of proportion by an emotional child. Nobody who'd sat in that hearing room believed him anymore. Captain Kessler received a formal reprimand for her role in processing the fabricated statement without verification, a real mark on her record, but not the end of her career. The review board noted, specifically, that she had come forward voluntarily before being compelled to, and that her testimony had been instrumental in establishing the timeline. I ran into her once, months later, at a base commissary, both of us reaching for the same off-brand coffee on a low shelf, and she said simply, "Thank you for not making that harder than it had to be." I told her I hadn't done anything except tell the truth when asked. She said that was exactly the point, that most people, given the choice between an easy lie and a hard truth, don't choose the hard truth, and she was trying to become the kind of officer who did, a little late, but not too late. Specialist Jonah Pratt received a formal commendation for his eventual testimony, along with a quiet, informal apology from me, not because he owed me anything, but because I understood, better than most, what it costs a 20-year-old to stand up to a lieutenant colonel, even 3 months too late. I found him in the same maintenance bay where this whole thing had started, still clicking his pen the same nervous 3 times, and told him what I should have told him the day he first brought me that folder, that carrying the truth alone for as long as he did wasn't weakness, it was just a burden nobody should have handed a 20-year-old in the first place. He shook my hand and said he'd requested a transfer to a different section, not out of shame, but because he wanted to start his career somewhere that hadn't asked him to lie before he'd even finished his first enlistment. I told him that sounded like exactly the right instinct. First Sergeant Rosa Iborra, who never stopped calling, never stopped saying the hard things plainly, was the person I made sure got named, formally and specifically, in my statement to the review board, as the reason I hadn't lost the thread of my own story during the months I couldn't yet prove it. She told me afterward, in her usual flat way, I didn't do anything special. I just didn't stop calling. I told her that was, in fact, the special part. 1 year later, I stood in the driveway of that same rented house, string lights still hanging crooked across the porch the way Sophia had put them up years earlier, watching her practice a speech for her 8th grade graduation, a speech, she told me with a grin I recognized as entirely her own, about knowing when to ask the question everyone else is too scared to ask. She hadn't planned to make it about that gymnasium moment specifically, she told me, but somewhere in the drafting, it had turned into exactly that anyway. I think about that gymnasium sometimes, a room I never stood in, a moment I only know secondhand, and what it taught me about the particular kind of courage that shows up in the smallest, most unexpected people. Osei spent 20 minutes trying to define who I was to a room full of strangers. It took my daughter one sentence to ask the only question that actually mattered. If this story reached you today, tell me in the comments what you would have done in that gymnasium. And if these stories mean something to you, stay close, there's another one on the way.